Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that may not be suitable for all listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. This is the conclusion to the Kentucky Bordello murders. If you haven't listened to part 1, you'll probably want to go back and get caught up, because there is a whole lot of twisted background to this story. But I thought to recap, I would read a 1997 headline from the Associated Press after an Oak Grove City Council meeting turned the town upside down 3 years after the murders had gone cold. Quote, "It reads like a dime store novel. 2 dead prostitutes, a madam who alleges that police officers, upset that hush money was stopped and fearful they were about to be exposed, pulled the trigger. An unlikely heroine, a city councilwoman who goes public with her past as a prostitute to help clean up her town. And it's all being played out in tiny Oak Grove, population 3,000. End quote. And now we'll go back to our timeline so I can fill in the gaps of that tantalizing bit of soap opera the Associated Press gave us. In the last episode, I told you about how the Christian County investigators pretty much picked Ed Carter as the killer from day 1 of the murders. All of the evidence was circumstantial, but they had a lot of it, and yet they didn't arrest him. And even though publicly he was the only one named as a suspect, they had other persons of interest that we'll get to later, because there weren't even rumors of these guys back in 1994. There wasn't much urgency in this case, not in Christian County or Oak Grove. There is one thing I agree with Tammy Papler on, and that's what she told Unsolved Mysteries. Quote, "They felt they didn't have to investigate it because no one's going to ask any questions. They're just 2 dead prostitutes and no one's going to care about it." The police in both forces always commented to the press that it was an active investigation, making vague predictions about future arrests. But as months slipped into years, the murders faded into the background of ongoing scandal and corruption happening with city leaders, in addition to the police. Around the time when Gloria and Candy were murdered, Oak Grove certainly hadn't redeemed itself. In 1993, the Elliott brothers were finally indicted in federal court on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Basically, they bought a piece of undeveloped land for about $35,000 and then sold it to the city for about $65,000 under a third, unrelated partner's name. They knew the city was in dire need of a sewage treatment plant and jumped at the chance to make a quick buck. The land became the site of a $6.6 million deal for the plant. Though all documents related to the purchase were in the third investor's name, it was fairly easy to surmise the brothers' involvement through their bank records. Jack Elliott gave interviews from his jail cell, refusing to resign his post as mayor while awaiting trial. But they had the money to hire very effective counsel, and by the time it went to trial, the third investor, a Kentucky banker, was killed in a car accident, and their lawyers basically pinned the whole scam on him. After a 3-day trial, they were acquitted less than 6 months after they were charged. A juror at their trial later told a local reporter that, quote, "They really wanted to stick it to the Elliots, but ultimately the evidence tying them to the deal was insufficient." Not to be outdone, by 1998, Christian County Sheriff Bill Dillard and his chief deputy were serving time in federal prison on drug-related charges. They later also had their cases overturned, but you can see the pattern of corruption was not limited to the small town of Oak Grove. Police officers all over the county, including Hopkinsville, had a long and storied history of complaints of brutality, Hopkinsville dating back to the 50s before Oak Grove was even established. Of course, along with a long history of brutality and corruption in Christian County, Hopkinsville, and Oak Grove, there was naturally a problem with racial diversity, with all 3 having almost all white police forces across the board. In In the 1980s, Hopkinsville started a police explorer program designed to reach out to different demographics, not just looking for people of color, but people from different social backgrounds. But they were obviously trying to fix their lily-white problem. One young man was recruited in the late 80s named Ed Carter. Yes, the same Ed Carter from the last episode. The cop who strong-armed Tammy Papler into putting him on the New Life payroll. Ed is an African-American man who had grown up on a farm, one of 7 children. He briefly went to community college and then reportedly quit to help his elderly and ill parents, taking the odd hourly jobs as he could. He was recruited by Hopkinsville police officer Danny Pollard. In 1990, Pollard got him an interview in Oak Grove, where he himself had recently transferred. Later, according to Ed Carter in his interview with Buddy Elliott, Buddy asked Ed if he hired him, would he do what he was told without question, and Carter replied with a quick yes, sir. Buddy then told him outright that he was looking for a black man to hire because he was afraid the NAACP was going to start a negative publicity campaign. While this may be true, it is not corroborated and is only Carter's story, but it does seem in keeping with how Elliott ran his force. Appearances mattered to Buddy and his brother the mayor, and they figured they could manipulate the inner workings themselves as long as they trusted their crew. And his approach, while incredibly inappropriate and offensive today, probably wasn't that shocking in 1990s small-town Kentucky. And frankly, it was smart. Buddy told him the truth, and then he treated Ed Carter well. He was generally a benevolent employer with his crew, pretty much ensuring their loyalty. And Ed Carter's career with the Oak Grove Force started out well enough, even though he experienced what we'd call a baptism by fire. They just threw him into the job before he attended the police academy. He was said to often pull off the road and conscientiously study training manuals during the slow hours of his shift. And Ed Carter really liked his job. Even over 20 years later, after the trial, he had fond memories of his early days when he spoke with reporter Nick Tabor for the Oxford American Journal. He said that God had blessed him from the first day on that job, and sang the praises of both his Oak Grove colleagues and the Christian County Sheriff's deputies. According to Carter, the deputies were always happy to come and back him up when he called, and they were always patient and understanding of his inexperience. Now, this isn't exactly the picture I've painted of the deputies because I've not read such a nice characterization of them anywhere. I can't help but wonder if he wasn't just slathering on the charm for the interview. Nick Tabor, the journalist that was reviewing Ed, felt pretty ambivalent towards him as well. He was sort of surprised at what a nice, warm guy Ed seemed to be. His ambivalence is understandable because by all accounts from the 90s, Ed Carter was not a nice man, much less a decent police officer. Remember, this was a police force of just 7 men. Their chief was the mayor's brother. They walked around with an untouchable swagger. But Ed was the worst of the lot. He was a bully and a proud womanizer. When he became a suspect in Gloria and Candy's murders, he didn't even try to use his own wife as an alibi, claiming he was having an affair with a married soldier at Fort Campbell, who he refused to name because he didn't want to get her in trouble. Yeah, right. You're accused of murder and you're worried about your mistress's job? He never did name her, and since you already know that he does eventually go to trial 20 years later, do you really think he wouldn't have sold her out by then? As for his wife, he probably knew better than to even ask her. When questioned by police, she was more than forthcoming. She remembered that he came home at 4 a.m. the morning of the murders. She rolled over and looked at the alarm clock and told him that, quote, "The only thing open this time of night are legs." She said he answered by asking when she planned to get the washing machine fixed. And then just a few minutes later, the phone rang. It was work, calling him to the scene of the murders. She told police that she had a missing handgun, a .22 caliber, same model as the one used on Gloria and Candy. Carol Carter told police she hadn't seen the gun in months. Ed Carter had told police he didn't have a .22 or access to one. But his wife did, and she said after the murder she went looking for hers under the mattress and it was gone. Just a couple of weeks later, she filed domestic abuse charges against Ed and then filed for divorce. I explained in the last episode how the police weren't exactly bastions of CSI while on this crime scene. Candy Belt was taken by helicopter to a Nashville hospital, and though semen was found in her vagina and anus, there was no specific determination of rape. I have also not been able to verify that Gloria Ross was or was not raped. And again, I hate to agree with Tammy Papler and her dead prostitutes comment, but do you really think they looked for signs of rape in sex workers? Even if they had found what modern forensics would consider to be signs of rape, the defense could easily write it off as the result of their work. So this avenue was not really explored, even though both women were found nude. The only reason they said Candy was raped was because of Tammy Papler's insistence that she would not have had sex without a condom. And then basically, they dusted the lobby in the room where the murders took place for fingerprints, collected a few hairs, and then closed up shop. The carpets, where blood had soaked through, had to be ripped out and the floors scrubbed. But only days after the cleanup, Tammy Papler reopened for business. Remember how I told you about the Elliott brothers getting popped by the feds for money laundering and fraud? With Jack Elliott giving jailhouse interviews saying he wouldn't resign? Actually, Jack did wind up stepping down. Maybe it was to step away from the heat, and maybe he was leaned on a bit. The Army definitely was ready for a change and a cleanup of the town's reputation. Enter a new mayor named Bobby Mace. He was a former military officer at Fort Campbell, hailing from rural West Virginia. He was a man determined to turn things around in Oak Grove. Buddy Elliott followed his brother out the door, resigning in disgrace, finally after the two wrought havoc in Oak Grove for more than a decade. He was replaced with Chief Milton Perry, who would go on to serve for 18 years. Now that Mayor Bobby Mace had a cooperative, or at least obedient, chief in place, he did make some changes. He stopped the police practice of strong-arming so-called donations out of local businesses. Tammy Papler wasn't the only business owner they had been extorting. Mace tried to model the renovation of Oak Grove on the Army, who after Desert Storm had sought to make life easier on soldiers and their families by extending the tours of duty so they wouldn't have to move around so often. And they also made major upgrades to bases, especially Fort Campbell, to make them more family-friendly. They built better on-post schools and daycares, formed little leagues, and even basic stuff like better gas stations and laundromats. With Desert Storm being the first major war since the Army went strictly voluntary, they needed soldiers and their families to be happy and as comfortable as possible during their service. Fort Campbell ranks grew quickly as it soon became known as a family-friendly base. Mayor Bobby Mace tried to emulate this by putting up more plastic siding housing all over, more fast food joints, and small shopping strips along with a big new Walmart. He reinforced the codes department and had a lot of the condemned old trailers torn down and appointed a commission to handle the city's tourism. They set up Halloween festivals, hayrides, and egg hunts and such. And that all looked great on the surface. Bobby Mace also directly went after the adult entertainment in town to go along with the new family values. This was in 1997, 3 years after the murders and after Tammy Papler had limped off with probation and the others had moved out of state. But Tammy had kept ownership of Cherry Video and pretty much just tried to stay out of trouble. But she was enraged when Bobby Mace got the city council to levy a new $5,000 annual fee on all adult businesses. She saw this as a personal affront, and on July 15th of 1997, she stormed into an Oak Grove City Council meeting shouting, "This town is crooked and I've got the papers to prove it." She outright accused Ed Carter of the murders and Les Duncan and the rest of the police force for covering it up. She went over the laundry list of circumstantial evidence against Carter: the failed polygraph, the lack of alibi, his forced paychecks from New Life, and also accused him of taking sex for bribes from the women without paying. She ticked off things she had paid for, like police lights, and the dollar amounts every time she had to hand over cash. But she also dramatically cried, "They're just roaming free and y'all don't care." It was hard to quiet Tammy Papler once she got going, so finally Mayor Bobby Mace slammed down the gavel and yelled enough. As Tammy was leaving, she told the council if they didn't believe her to ask Patty Ballou. After the meeting, Patty Ballou talked to her fellow council members and reportedly said, "You all know I used to work there, and I know some of what she's saying is true." Patty Ballou was one of Tammy's first employees at New Life. The young mother of two had followed a soldier from Fort Gordon, Georgia, only to be deserted once she got to Oak Grove. She tried waitressing to support her children, but couldn't make ends meet, and finally interviewed with Tammy after seeing an ad for the massage parlor promising big money. She worked at New Life for 2 years, going by the name Harley, pulling in as much as $1,500 a week. Not a bad paycheck, even by today's standards. She eventually quit, married a local man in a powerful family, got a real estate license, and eventually ran for city council. She was living a respectful life, coming up in her community when Papler named her at the city council meeting looking for support. Patty Ballou said despite her pleas, the council ignored her and tried to intimidate her into quitting. About a week after the city council meeting, she went to meet with Tammy Papler at Cherry Video, and a few reporters just happened to be there. And they just happened to catch her on tape saying she used to work there when one of them asked how she knew the charges were true. Patty claimed she didn't know she was being recorded, but it seems pretty obvious she did. The story hit the airwaves like a rocket. This is when the Kentucky Bordello murders soap opera really began. Papers, big and small, mocked the small town. Late-night talk shows lampooned it. Even supposed think pieces of the time were dripping with sarcasm and disdain. It's not hard to understand why. Tammy Papler hired a big-time lawyer who had represented porn kingpin Larry Flynn. She sued the city government to repeal the new adult business tax, and then revealed the name of a Hopkinsville lawyer, son of a state representative, as one of New Life's clients. The litigation and ongoing scandals of Oak Grove are astounding. Even when Bobby Mace was trying to clean things up in the early 2000s, there were so many lawsuits about police brutality, the worst of which ended in a $2.3 million settlement. A soldier from Fort Campbell was driving his son to the hospital when 2 officers pulled him over and decided he wasn't complying with their orders fast enough. They threw him to the ground, dragged him around in handcuffs, and stomped his neck. This was the final straw for their second insurance company, and they had a hard time securing a third. As you can tell from that winding mess I just told you, Gloria Ross and Candy Belt were once again forgotten, left by the wayside. An ugly piece of past that even with all the current bullshit constantly coming out of Oak Grove, no one seemed to want to touch. But finally, in 2006, the Kentucky State Police took over the double murder investigation from the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department. 6 years after taking it over, they charged Les Duncan with tampering with a crime scene. They accused him of throwing away shell casings, wiping fingerprints, and doing whatever he could to help out Ed Carter. Denying malicious intent, Duncan took a plea deal, admitting to mishandling evidence unintentionally. His attorney said he felt like what he did was wrong because he was a bad and incompetent detective, not because he was corrupt. But since he did destroy evidence, he was agreeing to a plea deal to put it all behind him. Turns out, Les Duncan's plea was what the state was waiting to pounce on. As soon as the ink was dry, the police issued warrants for Ed Carter and a man named Frank Black. No one knew his exact connection, but he had been a convicted felon living in Clarksville and working at the Opryland Hotel in Nashville at the time of the murders. The state insisted they had waited 3 years because they had to purge an entire tiny courtroom. The judge, prosecutor, and even a defense attorney all had to be brought in from out of state. Heading up the investigation for the Kentucky State Police was a detective named Jason Newby, who had grown up in Hopkinsville and graduated from high school in 1994, just before the murders. He had joined the Marine Corps and then joined the state police when he came home, working up from patrolman to detective. He considered the New Life murders to be the ultimate cold case and said he picked up right off where the last investigation had left off. The trial started in September of 2016. The theory of the murders rested on Frank Black. The state contended that Carter and Black attacked the women together and that Duncan covered it up. Newby had thought the pair wanted to take over the place and were trying to scare Tammy Papler. But this theory seems weak to me. I guess I can see why they initially brought in Frank Black, because he was arrested for attempted rape at knife point at a motel in Clarksville the day after the murders. He had used a fixed blade knife, just like the one used to slash the throats of Gloria and Candy, and he was a rumored customer at New Life. He wound up serving 7 years and was free by 1981. He is a registered sex offender to this day. The true MVP of the defense team at the trial was Leslie Duncan's lawyer, Stephanie Mize. She mercilessly grilled officers who had been at the scene and the Cumberland County Sheriff's deputies. Under cross-examination, she got them to admit to losing and even willfully ignoring a lot of evidence, including hairs, fibers, a knife, and even the victim's clothes. Tammy Papler had called the cops the day after the murder when she found their clothes in one of the bathrooms. She said they never even came to pick them up. And deputies Billy Gloyd and Malcolm Moore could not deny any of this. They often cited memory loss, but could not dispute her claims. The final blow to the prosecution was DNA. It did not match even one of the suspects. The DA tried to explain this by saying it belonged to an unknown customer, but remember, there weren't any customers on the books. The surviving women testified to it being really slow and no customers at all in the late evening when Gloria and Candy had still been alive. No one could say for sure that Candy had had a customer. And even if she had, no one had ever been questioned, much less tested to see if they matched the DNA. This alone is reasonable doubt. After the DNA revelation, Stephanie Mize took the unusual approach and asked the judge to set aside the charges against Leslie Duncan. And he did. Then the jury deliberated for only 2 hours before acquitting Ed Carter and Frank Black. Just a few months ago, in September of 2017, Ed Carter brought suit against Jeff Newby for wrongful prosecution and incarceration. He had sat in jail for 3 years until the state finally had a neutral courtroom and was ready for their case. The charges were dismissed on October 30th, but from courtroom gossip, Jeff Newby, and particularly the DA, got off lucky. How the hell do you go to trial with DNA evidence that doesn't match any of the accused? They already knew Les Duncan was not going to testify against Ed Carter, and I can't believe they would pin their hopes on an ex-con rolling over and admitting he was there just to cut a deal, when they had no physical evidence tying him to the scene. Ed Carter had for over 20 years shown he wasn't talking, nor did he even seem intimidated. Why should he have been? He could be innocent of these murders. You can be a disgusting bully who takes advantage of women and still not be a murderer. Honestly, it's unconscionable that these charges were even brought with so little evidence. During the trial, the defense managed to throw a couple of other suspects into the ring. It was discovered that the police had questioned Ryan Ross, Gloria's husband, and he'd even failed a polygraph test. Neighbors reported frequent loud arguments. One family friend claimed Ross thought Gloria and Candy were having a lesbian affair, and that he had said he would kill Gloria if he found proof. Supposedly, he even hired a private investigator. But there is no proof of this, only rumor. When asked by a reporter after the trial what he thought about being a suspect, Ross seemed genuinely shocked and said staunchly that he did not kill his wife and would take that to his grave. I believe him. There has never been a whiff of evidence to support any of the rumors, and polygraph tests are notoriously unreliable, especially when given to a grieving relative right after a murder. Another, more viable suspect, at least in my opinion, is a man named James Stephen Henson, who worked at an appliance distributor in Hopkinsville at the time of the murders. His girlfriend, Teresa Abbott, called the sheriff's department to turn him in. Their notes from 1994 show they did look at him and were able to prove he had a membership at New Life, and his name was recorded in the books as a customer. His girlfriend swore that he was out the night of the murders, and she didn't see him again until the next morning when he showed up with a gym bag that had a knife and a gun and some clothing in it, and then she said she never saw the bag again. She also said that he later admitted to her that he killed the girls. And even more interesting, Tammy Sneed and Millie Burns both testified at trial to seeing a strange man earlier in the night that seemed to be in disguise. He had an Alabama hat pulled down low and dark gym clothes on. The women thought he might have been Hispanic. This is the stranger I told you about in part 1, and James Henson does indeed have dark features and could pass for Hispanic. But did the police follow up this lead? Did they even collect DNA? No, they did nothing. They took the call from Teresa Abbott, wrote up a half-ass report, and filed it away. It is so frustrating to think that these murders could have been solved at the time. Though DNA was still in its infancy, it was definitely in use. It's also incredible to me that there was only a 35-minute window that Gloria and Candy could have been killed in. The other women said they left at 3:35 a.m. to take Andrea Fornella home, and swore they were back at the latest by 10 minutes after 4 a.m. This is supported by the guard at the gates of Fort Campbell, and also by phone records for when police and paramedics were called. How could someone slip in within that time frame, force the women to the back room, force them to undress, possibly sexually assault at least Candy Belt, if not both of them, and then slash their throats, shoot both of them twice in the head, and then somehow leave the scene undetected? Well, for me, Ed Carter is still the most obvious suspect. He was the only one who knew the layout of the building that well, and he would have known how much time he would have. He had motive, which was revenge on Tammy Papler, definite opportunity by still having a key to the building, access to the same type of weapon, and he was seen at the crime scene within 30 minutes of the murders. But with such sloppy, inept police work, from the lack of physical evidence collected or tampered with to the mysterious DNA profile, there's just no proof. So it wasn't Ed Carter's DNA or Frank Black's. It could be James Henson's, who, by the way, has never been tested. Or it could be another, yet unnamed or unknown assailant that was with him. Les Duncan does not really strike me as a possible accomplice. He was a messy, terrible cop. And it could even be he was messy on purpose for his friend Ed. But it's hard to understand how any lawyer would have advised him to take that plea deal when there was no one charged yet for the murders. Since it was his plea that set the dominoes falling to get Ed and Frank to trial, you have to wonder if the state had leaned on him pretty hard to take it. And this was also not the first time Duncan has been accused of mishandling a crime scene. A detective from Montgomery County, Tennessee, claims Duncan screwed up the investigation of a woman named Manuela Scarlett in 1992. Nothing has ever come of these claims, but it does stink to high hell that Duncan has such a reputation following him everywhere. And let's not forget Tammy Papler herself. Though she claimed to have paid over $20,000 in bribes, that sum could never be proven. She was also accused of having more than a so-called temper with her employees. It was said she was known to have thrown a slap or two and threatened to kill anyone that defied her. She also, just a week before the murders, extended New Life's hours from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. This is the exact window of opportunity for the murders. But even with all of this, I do not believe Tammy Papler did this or even possibly orchestrated it. She might have been a shrewd businesswoman, but I doubt she had either the brains or the connections to pull off something like this in order to frame Ed Carter. And what other possible motive could she have had? These women were her employees, basically just cash cows for her. And would she really bring a murder investigation into a business that was a front for prostitution intentionally? And of course, she lost money by closing down the place, even though she did reopen it only a few days later with the killer still on the loose. Ryan Ross and Gloria's 2 children sued Tammy and Ronnie Papler, as well as the landlord that owned the building A New Life, for wrongful death, blaming them for having an unsafe workplace. The charges against the landlord were dismissed. There had never been another murder or even an assault reported in the building, but the Paplers never showed up to court. On April 20th, 1998, a default judgment of $918,000 in damages was awarded to the Ross family due to the Paplers never having answered the summons. However, I seriously doubt Tammy Papler ever actually paid a dime. To me, money was all she ever cared about anyway. She never went public with her accusations against Ed Carter or the police cover-up until the mayor dropped that $5,000 adult business tax on her. Then, all of a sudden, she gave a damn and dramatically stormed a city council meeting. I've watched her interviews with Unsolved Mysteries and other news outlets, as well as her court testimony, and it's nothing but crocodile tears. I don't believe she ever would have come forward if her business hadn't been threatened. No, I think Tammy is a piece of shit. But I don't believe she is a murderer. Whatever she has slipped back into obscurity for now. And I would really like to know how in the hell they came to tie Frank Black into all of this. With his attempted rape a day later, he obviously did show a propensity for sexual violence and possibly murder. But it wasn't his DNA. So was there another man at the scene? Did Candy have consensual sex either off the books or with her own lover that wasn't a customer? We don't know, and we will never know because of the utter lack of investigation at the time of the murders. But hell, all 3 defendants could publicly confess, and there's nothing that could be done with double jeopardy attached. So due to the incompetence and long history of corruption within the police department and municipal leadership, we will never know. There will be no justice for Gloria and Candy. And we'd like to think that Oak Grove has come a long way in 23 years. But just a few weeks after Carter's acquittal this past September, Ben Walden, patrol supervisor for the Oak Grove PD, was arrested by his chief on charges of human trafficking. State police accused Walden and 2 others of holding several women at an Oak Grove motel against their will and forcing them into sex work. If anything, an Oak Grove cop has become even more disgusting and brutal than his predecessors. He isn't accused of murder, of course, but judging by his rap sheet so far, they might have just caught him before it happened. In September, Walden was officially charged with several serious crimes: first-degree rape, sodomy, assault, retaliation, and tampering with a witness. The main witness, whose identity is being kept private, informed law enforcement that she had been paid for multiple sexual encounters with officers from the Oak Grove Police Department. Ben Walden is still awaiting trial and no other officers have been charged as of yet, but the state police confirmed that not all Oak Grove officers have been cleared. Even now, if you visit the website for Oak Grove, a banner at the top shouts in red, writing that they are looking for 3 volunteers to become members of the Code of Ethics Committee. Well, I just bet they are. In 2011, Police Chief Milton Perry was fired by then-Mayor Dan Potter after 18 years of service for, quote, ongoing leadership issues, but it was in light of an investigation that stolen property from the city was found in the chief's home. Incidentally, he's the one that took over for Buddy Elliott when he had finally resigned after so much scandal. In an interview about the murders in 1997 after the infamous town hall meeting, Milton Perry admitted to accepting $1,200 in cash from Tammy Papler on the steps of the courthouse. But he still refused to admit it was a bribe. saying that Tammy was, quote, just in the Christmas spirit. And as I've said, Oak Grove police have been sued so many times that they were dropped by 2 insurance companies, mainly for charges of police brutality. One particularly stupid Oak Grove cop was caught on tape beating a drunken inmate at the small jail on the brand spanking new cameras they had just installed in an effort of transparency to try and keep their insurance. But they have also been under fire for their car chases. They outranked Clarksville and Hopkinsville in the number of chases they got involved in, especially those ending in injury or destruction of property. After the chief, Milton Perry, was fired, the new chief, Les Langdon, was fired in 2015 while under suspicion for drug-related charges and also domestic violence. His wife had to file an emergency order of protection. And Mayor Dan Potter astonishingly told the press that Langdon didn't hit his wife. You know, because he was there and saw what happened, I guess. The charges were eventually dropped, but that's not uncommon in domestic violence cases, of course, no matter the validity of the claim. Langdon went on to sue the city last year for wrongful termination and then settled out of court. And Oak Grove's current mayor, a retired and elderly woman named Bee Burt, has been reported to be an absentee leader. She is rarely seen at public functions, and it's rumored that County Clerk Teresa Jarvis really wields most of the power. And evidently, Oak Grove, Hopkinsville, and Christian County are all part of an even bigger issue. A 2014 study at Harvard University's Center of Ethics finds that Kentucky state government is among the most corrupt in the country, second to none when it comes to legal corruption of political favors in exchange for campaign contributions. And the FBI agrees. Special Agent in Charge Howard Marshall of the FBI's Louisville Division, joined by U.S. Attorneys John Kuhn and Kerry Harvey, started an initiative designed to solicit the public's help in identifying public corruption. As part of the End Corruption Now campaign, the FBI began an investigation into public corruption in Kentucky. The FBI website noted that between 2003 and 2012, approximately 300 individuals were convicted of federal crimes related to public corruption. Now, this was already a two-parter, so obviously I can't go into the minutiae of corruption for the entire state of Kentucky. But it's clear that the rot that festered into the tragic murders of 2 young mothers and the sloppy and infuriating investigation and possible cover-up that followed are just examples of the worst of what the state is suffering. I'm sure for locals, some of it is just plain embarrassing. DUIs, theft, sex scandals. But there were also officials in social work accused of abuses within the foster care system, preying on the weakest of Kentucky's citizens, its homeless children. The FBI's program included the launch of a new toll-free tip line, 844-KYN-OPC1 or 844-596-6721. There is also a billboard campaign and a dedicated email address, Kentucky_PC_complaints at ic.fbi.gov. Special Agent Marshall explained the new program. The End Corruption Now campaign seeks to unite the Commonwealth in the fight against corruption at every level, from the proverbial dog catcher to the police officer to the highest state and federal officials in the Commonwealth. And U.S. Attorney Kerry Harvey agreed, stating, "Public corruption is a terribly destructive force throughout Kentucky and has been a particularly pernicious problem in certain areas of the Eastern District of Kentucky. While the overwhelming majority of public officials serve honorably, those who corrupt the operations of government rob their communities, their friends and neighbors, of the fundamental right to honest government." I think Kentucky's issues were summed up more eloquently by Jennifer Brown, a longtime respected reporter and editor for the Kentucky New Era. In her summary after the trial, she wrote, quote, "We may never know who killed Gloria Ross and Candace Belt, But what we do know about the murders is that public corruption made them possible. We hope that Christian County as a whole sees Oak Grove as part of a larger community, a place that shouldn't have to operate as separate and unworthy of association and support. It would be unethical and dangerous to accept anything less." End quote. Sadly, much like the lives of Gloria and Candy, poor country cousin Oak Grove is lost in the vast wasteland of public scandal and corruption in the state of Kentucky. But at least now, many leaders from local to state levels are more than aware of their government's reputation and are doing their damnedest to take responsibility and make change. Southern Fried True Crime is written and produced by me, Erica Kelley. The original graphic art is by Coley Horner, and Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio. If you like the show, please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I know iTunes doesn't make it easy for you, but it is still the best way for others to find Southern Fried, so I really appreciate your help. I am also on Google Play, Stitcher, and many other podcast platforms and apps like Auto Radio, Overcast, and Pocket Casts. If you're interested in supporting the show, go to patreon.com/Southern Fried True Crime. I have different rewards for each level of donation and more planned in the next few months. If you have any comments, corrections, or suggestions, you can email me at southernfriedtruecrime@gmail.com. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for Southern Fried True Crime if you'd like to connect with me there. Thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.